Okay, we're going to start our panel discussion. I think we have about 15 good minutes for some discussion with the panelists. Some of you submitted questions, but I think I'd like to go ahead and start with some of the audience questions first. And if we get to a lull, I'll take some of the ones that were submitted.
Hi, my name is Xu Zhu. I'm a consultant to the pharma business. So this is a question for either Mr. Warma or maybe Dr. Cunningham. So we have seen a lot of orphan drugs. They have forecast peak sales in the blockbuster stage, and I think that's highly dependent on what the payers will do for them. What's your take on that? I mean, in terms of you choosing an investment, potential portfolio company for yours. What's your usual practice? Thank you.
Yeah, so it's a good question. So we have an orphan disease company, and that's actually an area of active interest for a lot of venture funds, because for a couple of reasons. One is that, and it sort of depends on the orphan disease. So particularly some of the childhood development orphan diseases where there's not really going to be any pricing pressure on that drug, because in the big picture, you're saving the healthcare system. If it's disease modifying, you're saving the healthcare system tremendous amounts of money. So nobody cares how much the drug costs. So that's one attractive aspect. The second is that for most of these orphan indications, you in fact do not have to do 2 large randomized phase 3 trials to get the drug approved. So the overall capital profile is much less. So it's an area that most venture funds will take a pretty close look at.
Yeah, I agree with what Casey said. We started an orphan program at my previous company. And for the reasons just mentioned, it can be attractive. Again, you need to do the homework and understanding what the true market size is. I mean, orphan is less than 200,000 patients in the U.S. And then there's also ultra orphan. You can kind of back yourself into a corner if the patient population is too small. But again, from a regulatory perspective, it can be and often you have less competition, so the regulatory path can be more streamlined, and you can get kind of the breakthrough accelerated. So it can be very attractive. As I said, what we did when we started our orphan program, which I think is really important, is to talk to the patient advocacy group. We started ours in neuromyelitis optica, NMO, and we worked very closely with the Gussie Jackson Foundation to understand, if they were interested in this, because you're going to get a lot of support or not. They can kind of come out, a little bit pushing against you maybe, but if they appreciate and understand what you're doing, and typically they do, because there's not a lot of folks that are working on their orphan indications, so they're very supportive. But it's important to understand what they're looking for. It's important to include them in the discussions early on, have them help you with the design of the clinical programs. They can be a huge advocate for the company as well. FDA, get in early and talk with them about the different regulatory paths, whether you're doing an SPA. So it can be a really attractive approach. Can be faster time to market, and it can be supported nicely by the VCs as well. But it's not that black and white either.
Yeah, and if I could just make one final point to sort of the larger audience, not just people that are interested in quote unquote orphan diseases. If you've got say a drug for breast cancer or something like that, the common pitch is the market is huge. I've got a drug for breast cancer, but that's a long slog that's going to cost a lot of money and take a long time. So sometimes it makes sense to separate your regulatory strategy and your commercialization strategy. And orphan diseases can let you do that. Because, for instance, in oncology, you just have to demonstrate that the drug works. It hits the target. It has the desired biological effect. Everybody believes then that I'll go find different uses for it, particularly in oncology or in some of the neurodegenerative diseases. So if you can find a little niche indication that's an orphan indication, to demonstrate that your drug works, that it hits the target and has the desired biological effect, you can have all the advantages of an orphan indication, and you're doing good for that orphan population, as well as greatly increase the commercial value of the drug for the larger indications. And so we will often, as we're starting a company, we will often sit down and think, is there an orphan indication that we could use to prove out this technology? And then we'll move to the larger markets.
Just last point, I'd be careful though, not kind of going out too aggressively and saying we're not worried about pricing reimbursement. So, the prices can be huge, and, you've got to be careful. This day and age, you've got to be really careful saying that. And although that's true that orphan pricing can be, you have more flexibility. But if you go out with that attitude now, you'll probably get a lot of pushback, and you'll probably get even a lot of the investors or people saying, talk like that kind of frightens us. So you're going to have to do your health economic analysis, and yes, it can save costs. So I'd be careful, just kind of, we're not worried about pricing. They'll pay any price because it's an orphan.
I don't need that. Well, okay, fine, thanks. Just getting back to that, how much of a difficulty is it getting to a clinical trial when you have these very small and very fragile patient populations, and how much does that stop your development? You're familiar with that from MS, I'm sure.
Yeah, very quickly on that, and the others can chime in as well. That's why I think it's really important to work with the patient advocacy groups, because again, there are folks that are doing that, and if they appreciate your technology, if they understand it, if it's something that they can be compliant to, if they like the science, because they're very sophisticated, these groups, and if they don't like your science, they don't like your mechanism of action, they're probably not going to be that interested. They're therefore probably not going to sign up for your trials. So the sooner you get their feedback and input and adapt your trials and designs, the better, because again, it can be a very small group of patients, and they have to be believers in your science and mechanism of action. And again, they know the stuff better than you do sometimes.
Yeah, just briefly, you mentioned that it could accelerate the path to market, but it tends not to. It tends to be about the same time frame, especially for people who are newly into the space, and that was shown from data back in 2015. So I imagine it's still pretty similar because of the difficulty recruiting patients, especially without the support of advocacy groups.
And look in other markets. Look in other markets besides the U.S. as well. Obviously, there's pockets of patients around the world, in Asia, Europe, that have the specific disease. So broaden your look beyond just the U.S.
Musculoskeletal researcher, and I'm interested in the drug discovery aspect, as there are no disease-modifying drugs for arthritis. However, arthritis is a quality of life issue rather than a continuation of life issue, and it's also a very long-term disease. Any advice on approaching that?
Yeah. So that's yeah. So that's right, and there are a number of disease areas like that. So the attractiveness of oncology is there's some crisp endpoints, and that's the key point. And one of the filters that we apply when we think about how you'll get this technology developed is how crisp are the clinical trial endpoints. And that used to make developing drugs for neurodegenerative diseases, post-stroke, all the musculoskeletal conditions exceedingly hard, because people have this annoying habit of sort of getting better on their own, and it just makes it tough. So what has changed probably in the last few years is the development of patient-reported outcome tools, PRO tools. And so that's how you try and measure the impact on the quality of life. Now, it's not as simple as just drawing up a questionnaire. There's an actual process that you have to go through, and many diseases already have them, and they're validated. The FDA approves them. And one of your discussions with the agency is, I have a set of patient-reported outcome tools here. Could that, in fact, be the basis for an approval? And you usually can get a sense from them whether or not they may want to see something else, some evidence that the drug actually has a biologic effect. But that's the path forward for those kind of diseases, is these sorts of patient-reported outcome tools, very rigorously defined, because again, you've got to have a fairly crisp endpoint, and those have to satisfy it.
So I think that obviously when you go into chronic diseases like that, a convenience factor is something that matters a lot. But going back to where we see of payer constraints is something that it'll be more and more challenging, especially as many of the old traditional drugs are now they will have a biosimilar and in a few years, and some have biosimilars right now. So I would definitely look for something. I started looking early on what is the feedback and what is the really, it has to be like an same efficacy or better with enhanced convenience.
I might also add as well, I mean, it is a tough area to be in for the reasons people mentioned, but yeah, for these kind of big diseases, it probably is a good idea to get in front of pharma companies, because again, these big, long trials, which, you know, you have to show just a minor differentiation or minor benefit over what exists. Those are big, heavy, expensive trials. And if you clearly do think you have something differentiated, I mean, I would sit down with pharma guys and say, look, do I have something here? And if they're excited and they're, you know, all into it, you know, they'll jump on, help you move it forward. If they kind of shrug their shoulders and there's no interest, then that's probably a good signal that this is going to be a real uphill battle as opposed to an uphill battle.
Yeah, and just who's going to care and why. That'll help you find out who you should talk to and what your story is going to be around getting investment and approaching pharma, and what is it going to mean for these patients for their lives to be better. And that will sort of be the foundation of how you start to have those conversations.
Hello, my name is Marco Morales from Clinicor, a clinical research organization locally. So my question goes regardless, could you talk a little bit more about the FDA voucher for orphan designation, and also for the reimbursement strategy? How soon do you approach your payers if you have preclinical or once you pass the phase 1 for the reimbursement strategy with CMS as well as for the insurance companies? About the voucher about the FDA orphan drug designation. How is the value in the market for pharmaceutical companies as well as for venture capital?
Yeah, so not every orphan disease is going to get a voucher. Those are typically pediatric orphan diseases, and they're very valuable because it buys you a really expedited review. So what happens is a company that gets one just sells it. It's usually what happens. So those are very valuable. And in terms of, you know, how soon do you start thinking, approaching the payers, even at the preclinical stage? That's probably too early because not enough is known about it, but it is never too early to start considering what the reimbursement pathway is going to look like. And
yeah. So I think in clinical, that's when you start approaching them. So what normally happens is, like, in some of the things that I mentioned, like regulatory, market assessment, how big the market is, having a patient journey or a patient flow, feedback from the payers, you do that in iterations. So you do like a basic understanding when you are more like in phase 1. Many drugs that will be successful will only have phase 2 because they're very innovative and they don't require to have a phase 3. And then you do another one in phase 2, and then you finalize all the details normally when you are like starting at 24 months before launch. So conversations with payers I would say will happen early on, because you need to have, one of the things that you have to assess is, regardless of what the ultimate goal is, which is that they cover, is like, what is the level of understanding that they have of the disease area? Because that will determine how much you need to educate and then convince them and present the cases so that it needs to get reimbursed if that's the case.
Yeah, make sure it makes sense for you as well. I mean, again, it's all the hype, and, you know, biotech companies are selling them for $200 or $300 million to pharma companies, and there's not a lot of companies doing that anymore. That's kind of pulled back, and, you know, it has to make sense for your company. It's a long process, and if you go in phase 1 and try to get the voucher, but you have to go through development and get, you know, get approval and such. So it's got to make perfect sense for your company. It's not like a easy thing to get it and go flip it for $150 million. That doesn't really happen. But again, if you go through the process, it makes sense, and you end up with because it gives you 6 months expedited, you know, path through regulatory. And for large pharma companies, that's a lot of money for them, so they can pay $200 million.
They're really rare.
Yeah,
and
I mean, that's why
I see decks all the time that say this is something that we're going to do.
And that's why you rarely see them out there. And because every time it happens, you know, it's a press release out by the biotech company. I don't know the last time I saw one was a while ago, so I'd put it on the back burner a little bit. It's not really something to focus on. It's a big strategy, I don't think.
I have a question for the panel. I'm Gabrielle Rodenko from UTMB. I wanted to ask the panel's input what do you think the prognosis is for drug discovery in the arena of severe mental illness? And I'm asking that given two things. First of all, that large pharma is largely quitting that area of research. And secondly, because some of the best accessible patient populations are in fact the prison system in the U.S.
So that's clearly an unmet need in a large patient population. The difficulty from a sort of a venture perspective about mental illness gets back to the earlier question about sort of the crispness of the clinical trial endpoints. They're exceedingly tough to measure. And once you start having clinical trial endpoints that are exceedingly tough to measure, the risk just skyrockets of getting your drug approved because you just can't tell. That's a tough way to raise money, is to go in and say, I've got a really risky, all biotech's risky, but have a really risky one. So I actually think those diseases are probably going to be more addressed by either a large pharma that decide to take that on, or some of these foundations like that.
So I was going to say the foundation, especially, I mean, if you've got the added challenge, as you said, that some of the best clinical subjects are within prisons. I mean, access to those folks are probably complicated as well, although maybe it's easier because they're all together, I don't know, but that's just a little bit of a challenge. But yeah, but I would look at the, well, but I would look, as Casey said, to some of the foundations who specialize in, who focus on these specific diseases, and I'm not sure who they're at, but there are some that, for whatever reasons, they've got that focus in that one mental illness category, and or a pharma. That's the place you'd want to at least go to first off.
On that, I'd like you to help me thank our speakers, our panelists, for enlightening discussion.